Hey guys, Phil here. No Darren tonight, so I'm your host of the No Guts No Galaxy podcast. Tonight is October 6, 2015, and because we don't have Darren, I'm actually joined by a guest, Chris, aka Spiral Face. What's going on, man? How are you?
Going good, Phil?
So, Chris, I talk to you every single day for the most part. You're one of my buddies online. I drop with you and we talk shop and stuff. But do you just want to sort of throw in maybe a little bit of background experience because you actually do have game development experience? Can you sort of dive into that a little bit?
Sure. I am currently working as a lead artist and project management for some mobile games at another company. I've been involved with pretty much BattleTech almost my entire life, and as far as the MechWarrior scene, I was pretty big into MW4 before I went off to college and pretty much had to get degrees and all that fun stuff. So been out of it, but I've been pretty much around in the MWO scene, mostly just on the casual side of the comp drops, but definitely looking around and tried to stay up to date with everything that's going on. So there's that.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you giving me some feedback, some back and forth, and we're gonna actually we're breaking down the podcast, guys. We're gonna do things a little bit differently. We're actually just gonna be picking like one topic in particular, breaking that down, and then basically that's it for a podcast. And me and Darren were talking about this, and we feel like it's a better direction to have a little bit more engagement and discussion and back and forth. And we're gonna have special guests like Spiral or others, out there in the community. And so for those out there, if you're interested in being on the show, we're going to be sometimes doing back and forth where we're literally the neutral moderator and we have a good guy and a bad guy or on this side. And anyways, we're really looking forward to it. So tonight's topic is actually going to be MechWarrior Online heat systems. So let's go ahead and dive into this because not everybody knows this. If you're new to the game, I feel like this is sort of information that needs to be out there. So let's just dive into like a basic explanation of the heat systems. We've got heat capacity, which basically is a numerical value to where once you hit that and cross over, your mech will shut down, right? I think that's a straightforward spiral. Any input on that?
No, that's pretty straightforward.
Yeah. You also have heat dissipation, which is basically how quickly your mech can cool back down to zero at any time. Now, one of the problems right now with heat in general in the mech lab is that all you have under your mech info is a numerical value called heat management and then a number. Now, I find this sort of convoluted and not really displayed properly because just like we were just pointing out, what does that mean? Like to a player, what I think is pertinent is that I know how long I can fire before I shut down. I need to know how as far as how quickly my mech's going to cool off at any period in time. So I need to know potentially where my capacity is so I can see the different combination of weapons. But that heat management number, I have no idea. Like we know the higher the number, the better, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much all we know at this moment about how that heat value is calculated. The tooltips basically describe it as the ratio between total heat dissipation and heat generation by firing all weapons simultaneously. Max efficiency ratio is 2.0. Like, but as far as how that number is pretty much calculated, it doesn't seem to have much correlation with any kind of metric that I've got, and it's a very convoluted way for most players to really understand heat management within the game itself. But truth be told, it's convoluted no matter what system you go to, because even if you go into Smurfy, like they just replace the heat management, you know, 0 to 2
Cooling
scale.
efficiency. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
to more of a percentile based thing, which I know for some people it's a lot easier just because it's a percentile as opposed to just an arbitrary number. But at the same time, it's still pretty convoluted until you actually get some experience under your belt and kind of play around and to see what kind of
Well,
heat threshold values is workable for you.
so let me toss this out to you. I have a third-party software program called Lee Song Mech Lab, and she updates this constantly. And by the way, if you want to check this out, there's a link over on our forums. You can download it. It's totally free. And what's awesome about this is they have, down on the bottom right, it has heat. And under the heat, by the way, and you can check, all of your skills tree to make sure it's eliteed. Um, but what you can do is you can load up the particular weapons and the heat sinks, and it literally says how many heat sinks, the cooling ratio, and when you mouse over these things, it pops up with how much of your maximal heat generation that can be dissipated. A value of 100% means that you will never overheat, which obviously isn't the case. And then it shows time to cool. And then it shows seconds to overheat, which basically means if you just fire continuously, how quickly, you'll shut down. Well, to me, instead of just having a heat management, I think it would go a long way of first pointing out to a player. Now, it may not mean much to an elite or a veteran player, but even then, I still think it's pertinent information where if you just had a time to cool in seconds and a seconds to overheat, it gives a lot better, and even I would say heat capacity needs to be thrown. Those information right there, I think, is a lot more pertinent than just heat management of whatever. Like that doesn't help me or a player at all. So I think those are little like UI additions they could do in the mech info that would like go a long way.
Well, another thing as well, kind of goes back to the threshold of, your total heat capacity before you actually shut down. I mean, most people don't even know how threshold really works within the game, but for every heatsink that you add to your mech, you're also adding to the total threshold that a mech can take. So if you basically start with just like the 20 engine heatsinks that are doubles, that gets you a threshold value of about 40 heat generated before you shut down. And for every heatsink that you put on top of that, you're actually adding 1.4 to that threshold value for every heatsink you put on top of that. I mean, I know that they do that because, in tabletop, it's 30 points, a flat rate between everything, but that's also kind of filtered through the idea that you fire weapons and then there's a heat phase where the heat sinks can cool everything. So they come up with this number with essentially a 30 flat value that is pretty much what you get in tabletop, and then adding in the capacity of all your heat sinks in order to dissipate that heat, which then gets you the total value. And this is something that also is just not explained whatsoever. So you could have like a mech that's just running, 20 double heat sinks in the CT, or you can have, a Timberwolf that is running a total of like 20 heat sinks on the mech, and the actual threshold capacity and the number of things that can be fired before you shut down is actually much greater on the Timberwolf than it is on, any other mech that just runs with just engine heat sinks.
Well, and speaking of which, I think that goes into the sort of difference out there too is when you look at doubles in general, they have the exact same capacity increase and dissipation rates. But, and this is one of those things where clan only having 2 crit slots for a double is huge. And example of this is if you load up any of these, Smurfy or Lee Song, MacLab, or any of these, and for a veteran player, it becomes clear that most IS mechs struggle with crit space, so that's why usually you only have Indo. Like mediums and above usually only have Indo. There are some rare cases, and that's because what you're doing is you're sacrificing, either you're taking, small amounts of large weapons, right? So you don't need all that crit space. But then because on some of these weapon systems where you need to increase your heat capacity and dissipation to be able to keep that sustainability, you just don't have it. And so right off the bat, you have clan doubles being 1-to-1 with IS, but already being above just because of crit space. And so, those are one things that I think, moving forward, they could potentially, play with. Like you could increase heat capacity on IS. Now you could even justify it, I don't know, coming crazy of they're physically bigger so they can hold more, coolant and they, stuff like that. So the dissipation rate may be at 1.4, but heat capacity goes up, and that could distinguish it between the clan. You could even do reverse of opposite of the clan, stuff like that, where maybe you want to decrease heat dissipation or increase heat dissipation but decrease capacity, or you leave it where it's at and just say, hey, we're going to decrease. So same dissipation 1.4, but we're going to hit it in the dissipation rate. I mean, there are things they could do to distinguish, but just the crit slot alone gives them a huge advantage, and especially when the tonnage of the clan mechs for the most part, not all mechs, you have a lot to play with, and that leads to some of the
Well,
systems we and problems we see.
you don't even have to keep it to the heat system itself, in all honesty. This is just a personal desire of mine, but one thing that I would really like them to kind of also include is just more of an incentive for kind of crit hit points difference between each of the things. So, like, let's say that a clan heatsink takes up 30% less space than an IS heatsink. Well, maybe it has 30% or even 50% less critical hit points, so they actually get blown out a lot easier. So you have essentially clan mechs are really powerful from the get-go, but they just don't hold up in an attrition fight because their components are getting blown out because they're smaller, more compact, and just don't take hits. And personally, I kind of just like kind of outside the box thinking like that because it kind of keeps everything at an understandable level so you can kind of explain to players that this is just a global system that this is how everything works, so you don't have to come up with special circumstances, but at the same time you're also kind of providing kind of a difference in play between the clans and the IS, which is something that I think is almost why clans are so powerful right now, because like there is no difference because they currently work under the same mechanics as IS. They become superior in every way to the IS because they just excel at almost everything.
Gotcha. And like I said, it does dive into a few other. We're gonna stay on topic. It does dive into a few other
Oh yeah.
things because of like Indo and Pharaoh and crit slot, crit space, and stuff like that. But also to sort of mention, you do have single heat sinks out there as well. And one of the problems is, how does PGI, how does Paul look at singles? Do they actually have a place? Where their efficiency may be lower, but their heat capacity is higher, or maybe I don't know. It's one of those things where singles, are they only a stepping stone, or should they be an actual viable alternative, out there? So that's one thing I like. I think we've heard sort of the idea from Paul that they're a stepping stone, but I don't think a lot of people like that answer because you know then there's no reason. Like the only people that really have them are new players coming in. They're basically penalized, because their mechs have them, or
Hmm.
trial mechs. So is it, can they be made useful? Can they be made to where, they're legitimate? They may not be as good, but they're not this leaps and bounds worse than doubles.
Yeah, I mean, it's always tough because it is a stepping stone, much like in, competitors to MWO also have upgrade systems where things, are meant to essentially be upgraded. And if that's kind of the decision that they want to go in, that's, hands tied on that. And it's not the end of the world. Like they're, in the grand scheme of things, relatively cheap to upgrade. And it's just something that, everyone has to deal with. But, also going, I don't think that there's an easy solution to make them better without pretty much just saying give them more capacity, give them more threshold, and just have at it.
Do
But
you do you close the gap a little bit between it and doubles, maybe?
you can if you want to. It all comes down to like what they want this game to be, and in the grand scheme of things, like where do singles fit in that kind of grand design scheme that they want to go at? Like, are they supposed to be that much of a detriment to new players who just don't know, or are they supposed to be incentivized that much in order to essentially impose the 1.5 mil C-bill tax in order to upgrade them?
Well,
I
I guess my problem is the sort of line of thinking, focusing on heat, but how it transfers over to when you look at IS tech. What happens when we do get future weapon systems and stuff with the same sort of mentality where everything else is supposed to be balanced, right? Like if you bring in ER mediums down the road, that and the mediums need to be balanced. So when this one piece of equipment, which is single, I don't know, that I guess that's what I'm proposing out there, and I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on this as well, because how do you do it to where they're useful enough, but not so detrimental because so what are the benefits, I guess, with single heat sinks compared to doubles? The first off, slots, critical slots. Like that's probably the biggest thing. I mean, but what you get out of those compared to doubles, doubles are just a straight upgrade. I mean, we tell that to new players all the time, right? But you know, and that's where I guess maybe do you want singles to where they're not as good as doubles? And I guess that's where I would probably say at least maybe close that gap and at least to be better than where we are right now. All right, so that's enough of like the basic explanation. Let's go ahead and move on to heat skill, aka ghost heat. And the reason I feel like this is very important is that um, so when this was introduced, the idea is it's a player behavior, right, modifier, right? I mean, it's to say you can take these, but if you do, you're then penalized. Now, the problems we've seen for a while now, and are just really just out there, are the loopholes in the system. So let me explain. Is you can take 6 mediums, 2 large pulse, and dual Gauss on a direwolf, and you can fire the dual large pulse and the 2 Gauss, and there's no penalty. You can fire the dual Gauss with the 6 mediums, and there's no penalty. And the reason why is, and players, and this is why, to be honest, this is why I love like the top end of things and the top players and skilled players is they're gonna find and they're gonna min max the shit out of your game, and they're clear indicators. And so there's a ton of loopholes like that, and you see almost all of the high end min max builds utilize most of these loopholes. Gauss, 2 large pulse on a Timby, 5 mediums and a Gauss. And so with this, there are loopholes in the system on both sides. You also have IS, by the way. There's no ghost heat for medium pulse lasers. Now, someone might argue, well, they're also 2 tons, they have shorter range, but they're also more, dangerous if you can get within that range.
I think the thing that we have to talk about before we dive into Ghost Heat, though, is really what its initial intent was. And that was pretty much stated as essentially a mechanic to curve the alpha mentality that has been plaguing every single MechWarrior game for all eternity, and rein it into a point where the pinnacle of mech customization isn't just spam single weapon systems. And when they initially implemented Ghost Heat, they implemented it under a scale of about 35 points for most IS customizations or weapon pairings as kind of the acceptable level for what, single weapon spam could essentially do. And what that led to was people pairing different types of weapons that didn't get affected with Ghost Heat together to create synergized builds to still
Yeah,
maximize
I was gonna
all
say
that.
the synergy. Remember, we used to see the PPC and AC5s, UAC5s, Gauss rifle, and ERP back in the day.
So I think that the big thing that kind of needs to be brought up before any of this is like back when it was inner sphere versus inner sphere, did it work to a positive effect? And secondly, like how did clans really kind of destroy that mentality? And the big thing is that we currently live in a game where 50 to 60 point alphas are the norm, and every single mech that has been released since pretty much the Timberwolves and Direwolves have come out have been held up against that same metric. Does it do 50-point alphas, and how well does it do it compared to all the other
And before
ones?
with IS, we were looking at 30 to 35, somewhere around there. With the dual peep UAC5 Gauss rifle peep with the Dragon Slayer, Highlander, Cataphracts. Those were the top dogs at the time for doing that.
So I guess the real question before diving into like heat scale itself is what do you see as kind of the end goal? Like what is a respectable alpha level that still adheres to like what they're trying to do and is still fun for players to try to chase down?
Well, let me toss out something even I think more important than that is should you be penalized for that? Like for instance, if a mech Hunchback 4P or Nova in regards, um, the mech automatically has a nerf. Like the Nova Prime automatically has a built-in nerf, which is the fact of it can't fire 12 ER mediums at one time. Trust me, you just die. It's because why? Because no matter the min-maxing you can do with the heat sinks, you can't create a heat capacity to where you do it. So you could do it once, and then you die, or you chain fire in a group. So I guess my question to you would be not necessarily what do we feel is the necessary alpha, but should a player and a mech be penalized for the potential alpha that it has as far as through heat? Is that the proper mechanic to be used as far as to say, no, we don't want you to be able to do that?
I'm personally not a fan of penalizing heat because the big problem with penalizing heat is that it affects laser weapons more than any other weapons. I mean, you see heat heat scale being applied to other weapon types like ballistic and missiles, and the only weapon outside of energy weapons that really care about ghost heat are pretty much AC-20s. Like Splat Cats, for example, like you get ghost heat after you fire like 3 missile systems. That doesn't stop Splat Cats and Mad Dogs from going around just alphaing ridiculous amounts of missiles everywhere. And it's just a system that unfortunately is weighted way too heavily in curbing energy use. And all it really does is force the synergy builds because people are getting around it. Like,
Because
you
they
know,
have to remain competitive and to like,
oh
hey,
yeah,
I can't do
but
so I guess the question would be if heat isn't an appropriate mechanic to penalize, because what you're getting at, and it's something I do agree with, is you're really just in a way build diversity is being molded. So in regard to it being a player modifier, I would say that's successful, but I don't think in the right idea, right? That the idea is we want to stop the mentality of yes, you can fire 9 medium lasers or 8 on that Hunchback 4P, but maybe you want to chain fire a little bit alpha, this or that. I mean, right? I mean, the idea is you're now basically saying, well, you may only want to take 8 medium lasers. Well, then why does my mech have 9? Like, why do we have mechs out there with multiple, slots like this, and I can't take them, right?
well, I mean, the entire reason it was implemented in the first place was to curb single weapon boating, which unfortunately has
Stalkers,
been. Well, even before Stalkers, like going back into MechWarrior 4, you had Nova Cats with, I think, what was it, 7 or 8 ER
6
large
ER
lasers
large and 7,
yeah,
yeah,
that
yeah,
they were running around one-shotting mechs.
yeah.
Like you just held your fire, waiting for a CT hit, and you could essentially core out a mech in a single shot. And that was almost universally what previous MechWarrior games boiled down to. And that's the entire design reason why they wanted to put in this heat scale slash ghost heat in the first place. The problem is that, you know, it was a system that was put in for the inner sphere and was never properly adjusted for the clans because the clans now can run around with 50 60 point alphas incredibly easily. Like what's the alpha on pretty much a Stormcrow that puts a single Gauss rifle and what is it, 5 6 medium lasers or something like that?
Well, and then on top of that, those particular weapons, the lasers being, you even heard Russ say it, laser vomit. It's lasers are so easy to use. Point and click, and so you can literally just spray out there, and now you got a Gauss rifle. I mean, you can put pinpoint accurate, and not just once. Like how many times you can fire almost like 3 4 times on a Hellbringer before you even have to worry about heat. And then on top of that, you have cool shot to it's just free more power creep to it. And it's one of those things where like there's no drawback. So side note, I've been against cool shot. I still don't like cool shot. It's one of those where I would have no problem if it did this. If you used cool shot and then that percentage of your coolant in your mech was flushed and your heat efficiency goes down. It's a trade-off. It should be a trade-off. Right now, it's literally just a free power out of nowhere, no explanation of where this coolant goes. And they're not pods for anybody who wants to be like, well, they have coolant pods. I'd be fine with coolant pods. They take up tonnage and crit space, but these aren't. All right, rant over. Um, so Ghost Heat, Chris, so me and you both agree that like, and I was talking to you about this before, and I just felt that there was something nagging at me because I was just like, I don't think heat's the way to go because to me, because one of the things we're going to do is we're going to talk about right now. In a second we'll talk is like what are quick fixes that you can do. But anything that I really look at is it's just like whack-a-mole. That's all you're doing is like you can create a weapon ghost heat profile for let's just say clan ER mediums and Goss or a large pulse, large pulses and Goss and stuff like this, or these different combinations to plug the holes and gaps. I think that's great. I think that's if that's what's needed into the game to help some of these get toned down a bit. But to me, the thing that I see is once you hit that dual large pulse Goss or dual ER PPC dual Goss or just single Goss, as soon as you do this, guess what? It shifts. They just shift to something else, and then those things aren't ever used again. And I feel like that's a sort of disservice to diversity of the game, dude. I like
Well,
to it's just like, oh well, I want to use that setup, but I just can't. So my question would be, before we move into quick fixes, would be what alternatives do we have out there, and are they easy to implement and easy to understand? Because one of my biggest gripes with Ghost Heat from the start has been the complete lack of knowledge of the player of the systems that are affecting him. The only thing you have, if your weapon systems equips have any type of ghost heat, is this little red, hey, mouse over, and you mouse over and it says, just let you know if you fire more than 6 of these, a ghost heat thing's going to be applied, and that's it. So new players coming in, they don't see it, they don't know, they're getting penalized, and
well, it's even worse than that, in my honest opinion. Like, the big things with Ghost Heat is, not only the player transparency, because you're right, it's very tough for new players to actually understand what is going on or why this is happening. But what's even worse is almost how arbitrarily and binary it is. Because you could be in, say, an awesome with 3 PPCs, and you are doing your damnedest to basically fire PPCs like in pairs of twos. If you are literally a millimeter or even like a fraction of a second, like before you pretty much can fire that second volley, you get ghost heat. Like it's a binary, you either don't get ghost heat or you do get ghost heat and you get it for pretty much the full value of it. And it's just insane. Like you could literally like miss a shot by a fraction of a second and be heavily penalized for doing it. And unfortunately, it's not transparent to the new players. It's completely hidden in game, and it's led to people, macroing keys. I
yeah.
remember when was a big thing when Ghost Heat first got implemented because of this reason.
So,
It's
I think we can all agree. Like I remember and many times I said I think Ghost Heat is a band-aid system, and at the time I remember saying I just don't have an answer for you. At the time is what are alternatives? Now, one alternative I've heard is I think this was a homeless Bill. Don't kill me if that wasn't. I think it was Bill or someone that posted the energy pool. Now someone may be saying, "What the hell are you talking about?" When we talked about this on the podcast, but basically the gist of it is that you have an energy drain, sort of like it pulls power away from your your heat sinks and it pulls power away from your movement attributes and to power your weapons. And so what it does is it places a value on per weapon basis. So, for instance, we were talking about this earlier, Chris. You would say, let's say you want the threshold to be 30 before any negative movement or heat efficiency problems start happening. You would have a combination of both. So what happens is you would say like, okay, I want to let the player be able to shoot 6 IS medium lasers. And so let's just say arbitrary, you put it at 30. Well, then, each medium laser would be, 5. And so what you do is you then use that as your base of saying, okay, that hunchback can fire that AC 20 and those 3 mediums, and there's really no penalty. But the difference is now, because when you mouse over that weapon system in the mech lab of that, clan Gauss rifle and that clan ER peep or whatever, it actually tells you that the value, the power drain, and that a direwolf now that fires dual Gauss and dual peep or dual large pulse and whatever would actually be affected in its movement and its heat system. Now, how you could justify it was, again, it's drawing power away from those systems to power your weapon, which achieves, in my opinion, the exact same thing as what Paul was saying as far as the player mechanic, right? Because basically it's saying is we don't want you doing these things, or if you do, you're penalized. Now, I'm going to throw something out towards you, Chris, because I just said about this power drain system before I even go any. You can do that with Ghost Heat. In reality, you could spin it however you wanted. You could justify it and say Ghost Heat right now, albeit like we just said, there's faults because it doesn't display properly to the player. But you could literally put the spin on it that it draws power away from your reactor core to power your weapons, and your heat systems. Now, it doesn't affect your movement like you think it would, but you could justify it like that. But what that's one idea out there, and I think that would actually be better than our current system. And the reason I say that is, at least then the player can't min-max their way around the system. It's clearly displayed in the mech lab on a per weapon basis, and it achieves the exact same thing Ghost Heat is supposed to be doing right now, which is a player modifier. And also on top of this, is it it doesn't necessarily just touch on heat. So it's not just a smack just to heat systems, and then it forces you not to take those systems anymore. You could put maybe more emphasis on mobility on certain weapon systems being drained. So, like for instance, a Gauss rifle may not necessarily put a drain on the heat system, but puts a drain on the movement or something like that. I don't know. It's just one of those. But even then, I feel like we're still in an odd place because inherently it's still going to affect the min max and of how players look in the mechs and how can we get around it, or does it ultimately do the thing? And I don't think heat is the way to go. So that's
I don't
where
either.
that's like I just feel like it's but what alternatives are there to outside of this energy pool or some convoluted thing? How can you allow a mechs to have diversity based on their hard points but not be penalized for taking 9 medium lasers on a 4P when the mech is supposed to have it? Now, granted, some of the problems that you were talking about earlier with Mech 4 and Mech Warrior in general has been the fact of we just had a crab come in that's all energy. We had a black knight that comes in all energy. About to have a wolfhound that comes in that's all energy. Grasshopper all energy and a few missile. But some of these are literally supposed to just be just energy only. Um, but
Well, and that's good. The biggest challenge is that if you completely remove Ghost Heat from the equation, then all of a sudden, most of the mechs are probably going to revolve around who can boat the most of Weapon X and do it more effectively than Mech Y. And I don't necessarily want to see MechWarrior Online turn into all the previous MechWarrior games as far as customization that was really more of just an illusion of choice, and it just came down to boating. I think that I think they implemented Ghost Heat with the best intentions, and in all honesty, when it was first introduced to the game, it actually, even though people were kicking and screaming, it did what it was supposed to do. It curved single weapon boating and introduced weapon synergies, which admittedly is a step forward for the franchise, or at least the PC franchise of the game as a whole compared to previous MechWarriors. The problem is that people are still doing the massive alphas. So the the first question, obviously, to the audience and everything like that is 50 or 60 points of alpha, like, is that an acceptable value given that only a fraction of the mechs in the game can pretty much you know logically dish those out in any kind of regular amount? And then after that, it kind of just comes down to, well, what do we do to address it? Like, I mean, the heat energy draw is something that Bill wrote about, I wrote about it, and it's a popular kind of mechanic that, a lot of people
I
would
think
like to
it's a good
see.
replacement for the current
Yeah.
system, but I still feel that it falls short in the grand scheme of things.
Well, okay, so for me personally, like we were saying, I think I agree. Heat is just a dead end argument because it just affects laser weapons more than anything else, and you're going to overtly punish, the use of anything but laser weapons. And the problem is that people have basically shifted to still use nothing but laser weapons, but they construct their builds in very specific ways to circumvent the ways that you get ghost heat. So you only see two clan large pulse lasers ever on a mech, and supplemented by ER meads. You only ever see,
Well, case in
um,
point, your larges, you hardly ever see them
yep.
because the heat and ghost heat applied to them. So again, it's one of those like, yeah, well, you stopped the boating of those, but then what do? They go to the next. I mean, it almost feels like any penalty that's introduced, albeit even slightly, has this negative effect to where then either they shift to something else, they drop one or two of the weapons and put more doubles on, and so
So what I this is just my own personal opinion on this, but what I personally would like to see is a system that doesn't revolve around heat, but instead weapon recycling. Because I think that if you shift the discussion to recycling over heat, what you can pretty much end up doing is you still allow mechs to have those massive alphas, but what they don't have is the DPS to sustain those alphas, because if you link everything together to where you're drawing from like a single energy pool, so you can't find any way to pretty much get around the systems, you always have the option to pretty much deal these like 50, 60 point alphas on your builds that have this amazing amount of pinpoint, but doing so would maybe nerf your overall DPS by something like 20 or 30% or wherever you set the threshold values for. So that way, rather than trying to overtly punish people for trying to chase massive alphas, instead introduce a gameplay skill system to using alphas. So at any point in time, you can alpha, and you can pretty much, get that damage when you absolutely need to. But you can't be expected to just throw 50, 60 pinpoint damage shots continuously throughout the entire match. It's about creating opportunities to pretty much close. And if they're just doing these massive alphas and the recycle hits their DPS enough, it should hopefully give enough of a window that like more DPS oriented builds can essentially tar pit it and take it apart because you know uh, you just have either DPS like in a Jaeger mech or in something like an Arctic Cheetah that can get off 30-point alphas every few seconds. Um, or you can still have like that very big long range punch, because for me personally, I think that whatever they do, like you can attach heat, movement, whatever to the equation, but whatever they do, they have to make it not so binary as it is right now. So let's say, for example, a Dire Star, where it's a 50 pinpoint alpha with the two ER PPCs and um, the two Gauss rifles. Let's say, for example, that you put your cap at essentially 30 damage, and anything over that penalizes you in whatever way. Like, what would be great is if instead of just an arbitrary, oh, you do one over, you get this set value no matter what it is. I would much rather have it to be, oh, you have like a bar that pretty much goes up and will dissipate, much like the energy draw system. But if you go over that bar, your penalty isn't based on what weapons you fire or what kind of combination you were doing, but instead just have it be a flat value. So if you go 1 point over, let's say like for every point over, you get like 0.25 heat and plus 1% added to your weapon recycle time. So in the event of firing two Gauss rifles and two ER peeps, you're doing essentially a 50-point pinpoint alpha and 60 point with the splash damage. So either 20 or 30 points over like a threshold of 30 if that's where you set it to. So under those numbers, you would see either like a 20 or 30% recycle nerf to those weapons for alphing them at the same time, and just a modest amount of heat with, let's see here. I'd have to do
So I
the
mean,
numbers later.
in theory, it's like you could almost look at maybe a setup like a almost like a tank destroyer in other games where your mentality is I'm setting this mech up to alpha, but then I fully know that when I do alpha, my cooldown basically is going to be longer, so I'm going to be either exposed if there's movement penalties or slight maybe heat or a combination, or if it's just movement. And I feel like movement could be it. So the system, what you're saying is it sort of caters towards you want a well-balanced DPS sort of centric mech where instead of it being full potential alpha where you fire all of your weapons, you want small group fire to be a thing and that alpha to be just on a case by case basis, not just a normal game, as far as just firing all the time.
Because if you look at the game right now, like DPS at high tier levels don't really exist because
It's all about the
like
alpha.
yeah, it's all about the alpha, but even more importantly, it's all about the face time. So a lot of the high tier builds are all about getting a massive amount of damage applied to a mech in the minimum amount of time, and then going into a defensive position while you wait for the weapons to cool down. So that's pretty much, what is there right now. So it would be nice to see kind of a much more balanced approach to still kind of allow those kind of gameplay styles to exist, but still give the DPS builds at least a little something extra for, just the sheer fact that they're face tanking everything to fire those Ultra AC5s off
Yeah.
or something like that.
Yeah. Now, obviously, don't want to cross over into weapon balance and stuff like that. That'll have to be another podcast. But speaking of what we're talking about is what could ghost heat be changed to, or what could be changed from heat scale maybe to just instead of it. There are some quick fixes that I think need to go in and stuff that needs to be plugged. The Gauss, the large poles, especially on clan side, where some of these builds are just getting away. And I would even say that, the top players out there, they're wanting these changes and they'll continue to use. My only concern is, even with these band-aids, what I call them, it's whack-a-mole. As soon as you plug that, are they still going to use that dual large pulse Gauss? Now, will it cut back on their effective volley to where maybe they hold off a second, to where now a Gauss rifle and dual large pulse is actually making the heat spike, and stuff like that. So my only concern is I feel like that's what it would. Now the end result would be their damage values drop, or maybe they find any other loopholes, and that's where I feel like, again, it's always like chasing your tail. You're trying to get that mole, but I do think for right now, because I don't see heat scale changing to whatever to be updated entirely or removed or replaced, I think quick fixes need to go in, and I think it's appropriate. And the community, and for you guys listening or watching, or listening or both, whatever it is, if you're watching on YouTube, I'm gonna link a discussion thread about this podcast down below, and go there. And for you top comp players, we need to give some feedback on what are quick fixes that you think, what are combinations that they can do, for ghost heat in general that would help some of these things. Let us know what you guys think. Quick fixes that you think are being exploited right now, and I don't mean exploited in a bad way. You're not a bad person for doing it. It's the nature of min maxing. It's what we do. It's what players do. And for me, when I look at all of these things that go on in the game, I look at it as more of like it's the players telling you where there's where there's holes, and okay, hey, yeah, we totally understand that. That's not maybe the behavior we want, so we're gonna fix that. We're gonna address that. That's how I look at this. So
And I think that that's what has to be emphasized in any kind of discussion about this. Like, not, what is absolutely wrong, but what do people actually want to see out of this game? Like, what is what you would consider an acceptable alpha that most mechs can do? And should there be any trade-offs for mechs that pretty much can achieve higher amounts of alpha, and
yeah.
what those trade-backs should
You
be?
know what I like about your suggestion is that you're not going to kill build diversity and sort of shoehorn people, which I totally concede. I think it was the implementation of Ghost Heat had good intentions, and it did fix and curb a few select builds that were pretty just stupid. But in doing so, they sort of moved to this build mentality of like finding the loopholes and finding that good amount of alpha damage and movement and stuff like that. And I again, just to sort of preface this, these are just ideas, guys. It doesn't mean just because like we're like, oh yeah, well, this sounds cool. It doesn't mean it's going in. I think this kind of discussion is great, and we do want to hear from you guys. And it would be great to maybe talk to Paul on this. And actually, me and Darren are going to reach out to Paul and bring up some of these. I think it'd be great to hear his feedback and how he looks at this in general, maybe even Russ as well. But I do want to say thank you, Chris, for being on this podcast. It was a real pleasure. I like the back and forth, especially me and you talk all the time on TeamSpeak about having this sort of
Oh,
the
yeah.
technical, sort of on the spot, Darren being disconnected from net. So thank you for filling in. And I think you did a good job. I think that's, yeah.
Yeah, thanks, guys. I'm a little sick right now, so sorry for my incoherent babbling, but
Sorry, man.
thanks for having me on.
All right, guys, I just want to say a big thank you to our community, our listeners, new and old. I mean, we have guys that have been listening for like 3+ years. It's crazy. Thank you so much to our staff behind the scenes, everyone that helps out at NGNG, and to our patrons. By the way, speaking of patrons, if you weren't aware, we did set up a Patreon page as an additional way for you guys to support NGNG if you're so inclined. If you would like to do that and want to see more, check out our Patreon milestone goals and support us for a little as like $1 a month. It's at patreon.com/NoGutsNoGalaxy. I'll have that information and link in the description below of this video. But just want to say a quick shout out to you guys. And of course, for our current patrons, you guys are going to be listed at the end. Thank you so much for your support. It's awesome that you guys, see all this in us and want to support what we do here. So just want to say thank you again. So anyways, guys, this was your local No Guts, No Galaxy MechWarrior podcast. Signing off for tonight. This is Phil.
This is Chris.
Until next time, Mech Warriors. Peace.
Peace out.
Da, da, da. No, that was good. I think that it's very tough because at the end of the day, like you almost feel like diving into it's like, oh, it's we're talking about crit slots, and then you talk about weapons and balance, and it's like multi, it's like there's so many layers to how these things, but sometimes you just gotta focus on just one topic
Oh
and
yeah. Well,
stay the course.
it's also just one of those things where most systems in game production are about targeting very, very specific things. Like Ghost Heat itself was implemented not to basically curve alpha play, but to curve single weapon spam boating. So I don't think that when they, approached Ghost Heat, they were coming about it from, a build synergy point of view, because to them, like MechWarrior has always just been about single weapon spam, so
Yeah.
they were just addressing that problem
Yeah.
itself. So
And I think that's just an inherent nature of BattleTech, which is when you have small, medium, and large, and medium, especially lasers in this regards, do so much for their tonnage, usage, and then as you moved up, we used to see, the Scalpel 5 large laser cataphract 1X back in the day, right?
oh yeah.
Because you could do that. And so, how do you basically say, no, we don't, that's not how we intend it to be, and that's detrimental to the gameplay or this or that? And how do you introduce a penalty? Because basically that's what it is. It's a player modifier, whatever you want to call it, but it's a penalty system that says instead of doing that, maybe you need to but there's other factors too. Like, why are some mechs able to do what they do? It's because they have such high heat capacity, right? The
Well,
clan mechs in general, like most IS mechs, to be fair, especially the top ones, the only reason they're able to do what they do is because of very large quirks. Usually, I mean, your top performers out there, it's usually because of quirks, and unfortunately, because of some of those heat gen quirks as well, new mechs come out like the Black Knight, and they don't perform as well as like the 5SS or the Grasshopper because those now have, and that's where I feel like too, on top of the heat scale system, then on top of heat gen quirks with basically energy, some of these are obsoleting. That's where they make other chassis obsolete when it comes to the min max nature, and that that sucks because that's and when you have so many mechs out there, and you're bound to have repetitious load as far as like chassis hardpoints. It's gonna happen. Like, how many 50-ton mechs do we have right now? How many 55-ton? And as soon as you introduce more, there's only so many different combinations, and because it's already predetermined by TROs or what their loadouts
that's
are going to be, and
well, I mean that's an entire different discussion
I know,
topic
I know.
in general. Just because I do think that we are at this point in time reaching kind of the zenith as far as what a linear scale of usefulness can really get you.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, everyone just goes for nothing but firepower because you can drop people too fast, and none of the other
Well,
pillars in Paul's, kind of system currently matter.
Well, and
So,
but look at also from I was watching G-Man's video recently, and he was talking about the Marauder and Warhammer, and he hit something on the nail, which was it doesn't necessarily have to do with heat per se, but it has to do with the alpha potential out there. If you're a heavy or a medium or an assault, to be able to take the type of firepower to try to compete with some of these clan mechs, you have to take an XL. But as soon as you do that, you're now vulnerable. And you then take an XL, you're still not able to compete at the same level of the 40, 50, 60 alphas. Remember, we were talking about prior to clans coming in, 30 to 35 was a pretty high alpha. So it's one of, and we're also talking about range here. Like if you were to look at the Orion or Black Knight and compare them to the Timberwolf, the Marauder coming out, and he made a point of saying, so okay, you don't go with the XL, but now you're going slower and you have less firepower to be able to go up against. So it's like this, you're screwed if you do and screwed if you don't. And let's just say you do take a bigger engine to try to go faster, well then you have no firepower to deal. So it's one of those things where I think all of these little things, that the IS versus clan balance, and this is one of those things where I was talking about, PTS. I like the idea of just erasing everything and saying, you know what, we need to fix IS and clan balance first. Because
they need to at this point.
well,
Though.
you have to start from scratch, and you have to say what is an acceptable level. That Orion and that Black Knight and soon to be Marauder have to compete against the Timberwolf, and the Timberwolf now is more mobile than all three of those mechs. By I think even if you were to say the Orion and them had the 360 maneuverability, it's still more mobile, has the same amount of protection, okay, but then it's able to pack so much firepower, heat, sustainability, and one also I think the shape of the mech as well is not to mention Clan XL survivability. So those are the type of things IS mechs are trying to fight against, and then you say, oh well, in BattleTech the IS assaults are supposed to be sort of the counter to the clan heavies, but even in how the current gameplay works, because IS mechs are generally bigger, or clan assault or IS assaults are generally bigger physically, that's a detriment in MWO where speed and maneuverability plus that pinpoint alpha, just wrecks him. So again, I feel like you wipe everything clean and you start from scratch, and you don't worry about chassis diversity or variant diversity at the first. I'm saying you literally say IS versus clan. it all together. Now that may mean you look at the big numbers. You look at the 75 tonners, you look at the 55, you look at the hundreds and 35s. Because if they feel balanced at that level, then it'll feel better down below. And once you get your balance achieved right there, then you can say, now let's look at chassis diversity. Now let's look at variant diversity after that. But even then, I feel like other things have to be introduced that aren't currently here because weapon quirks alone aren't the answer. You need critical hits need to be a thing. The slow degradation of your mech, not just this black and white thing. Actuators can be used and all
Yep.
of these different things. Gyro hits, and I'm not saying mechs fall over, but there are other factors to the mechs that can be introduced to where protection wise, when you say protection, you think structure and armor, but it could also be other things like decreased crit chance or hardened, actuators or,
Yep.
I mean, all those type of things to where it adds value, but gives the developers multiple options to be able to balance, especially when you look at, dude, I mean, you have talked about it like the Stalker and the Battlemaster, like they're identical mechs, but which one's better? The Stalker. Why? Because of physical geometry and hitboxes. So it's very difficult to distinguish just with, just weapon quirks or just maneuverability because you only have so many variables to play with. But
Speaking speaking directly on those critical hits, this is something that what I touched on in the podcast is something that the more and more I think about it, the more and more I would
oh, I'm
love
I'm still
for
recording.
developers.
I'm
Oh, are you?
yeah. This is the After Hours podcast.
Oh, jeez. But one thing I would love for them to do is just globally for all clan equipment, just say, you know what? 5 critical damage across the board. And this is why. This right here is an original generation Game Boy. Got bombed in the middle of Iraq and still frickin' works. Take an iPhone and drop it on the floor, more than likely the thing breaks. Like, you could be newer, you can be better, but if you're, pretty much paying for equipment on the clan side that does a lot more, it weighs a lot less, and takes up a lot less space, like, I don't think it's unfair to basically say, guess what? It pays for it through like critical damage, and it's more susceptible to being
Well,
blown
the,
out.
the the problem is though is what that would entail is to like a breakdown of how do we feel and it's like PGI how does Paul feel as far as um the destructibility and process of destruction of mechs, right? Like right now it's black or white. Yes, we do have crit hits. You can even, oh, you lost a double and oh, you lost a weapon or whatever. But usually it's your torso, internal structure, and that torso's gone, right? Like there isn't like case in point, the Nova Prime, an arm, right? It isn't like the Nova Prime loses all of its weapons and it's just hanging there and limply useless, right? Or like you took a hit to the leg upper actuator or something and so your overall turn radius has been affected or stuff like that. I guess what I'm saying is like that's where the idea of you have this armored machine and that everything underneath has a gameplay impact and that it's not just so black and white to where you can just buzz right through a left right torso and kill everything, but it's more or less you may want to systematically, and we used to see this back in the IS days, where you'd want to go after that right torso of a particular mech, right, to defang it, or
Hmm.
and you don't have different weapon statuses or equipment statuses. Like, why couldn't uh, my Hunchback? Maybe your Hunchback 4G, right? You're carrying around this big old boombox, right? It's an amazing weapon, but one of the detriments is it's the Hunchback. You're going to go after the right torso, especially before quirks were implied. You just went after the right torso. There was no gameplay. Well, if you gave it a hardened, um, if you get it a hardened where you couldn't knock out the AC-20 easily because of how many crit slots it takes up, and also, what if you had different statuses for weapons to where you had destroyed, which means the weapon was knocked out. You had maybe a slightly damaged, so it affected your attributes of the weapon cooldown or heat gen? What if you had a different status of maybe the weapon blinks out and it's just sort of blinking, and it's because its power just
Well,
got cut and your system has to reconnect? I guess what I'm saying is
so
like the breakdown of the mechs. Like,
that's fine, but I think that that's like a supplementary system because right now we don't have. It's all about finding that range, and that's like on one extreme range, and just kind of fills in the gaps. But right now we don't even have it where you pretty much have a system where if you crit out a weapon or a heat sink, it's because you got lucky, and not because you know the mech was exposed. And in all truth be told, like if they decided to basically just say all equipment across the board goes from 10 critical hit points to 5 critical hit points, so just so you could see like critical hits a lot more frequent, like I would be personally fine with it. And on the clan side of things, like I think that it would be great to,
but
base.
I don't think it matters in the grand scheme of things right now because mechs die so quickly.
Well, and that's the thing is that it's all about order of operation as far as how you handle this. Right now, you can't even put that on the table right now
Yeah.
because
Well, you could, but
the
you're not
right.
gonna see the benefits of people like, oh well, that doesn't, just like I would just said, it wouldn't change anything at all, right? But
Because that line of thinking comes down to, oh, does it do a 50-point alpha? Like G-Man's video, I think, highlights that perfectly. It comes down to whether it does a 50 or 60-point alpha, and if it doesn't do that, it's not even going to be in the discussion for viable at this point in time
yeah.
because
Now
that is just
they
the
want
system.
it to be. He wants it to be. They want it, like, but
Oh,
it's
yeah.
the reality of it. They can't compete against especially the clan. So no, I think what your suggestion is, again, sort of the breakdown of what are the nuances of, do mechs have so much structure that you're literally there, you want to target individual systems of the mech and stuff like that, but you don't want it just where it's just a grudge of just you shoot, like, and also the matches last 15 minutes. It's one of those like, how quickly should a mech die? And do you want it to mean something? But right now, again, it's black and white. And even when it comes to like balance of like ISXLs compared to clan, right? You don't want to introduce the clan sort of uh, survivability to the XLs, because then it just sort of negates the standards. Now,
Well,
if you had a in-depth sort of more critical, and where engines themselves actually attributed to the hit points or survivability of the mech, you can make it so standards literally make you, uber tanky or whatever or something like that. But
yeah.
right now, that the trade-off of ISXLs is really what IS lights and some mediums, not all mediums, but some mediums can get away with it. But then after that, you only have a handful of heavies that can pull it off. Um, and I'm gonna go out on a limb and say for IS side, there's only the Victor is an XL friendly chassis, but the problem with it is it can't fight in this 50 plus alpha place. It just can't. Like it can't. Like it tries, it might, but it just can't. Um, but anyways,
And that's always going to be the problem until the problem gets solved. I mean, that's just where the game is right now. Sucks, but you know,
it is what it
it's
is.
it is what it is at this
It is
point.
what it is.
Yep.
All right, guys. That concludes the after podcast discussion. Which is funny because usually what happens, like when we used to do like the podcast and we'd have people in the room, we'd pull them up to the public room, and like normally what would happen is we would have another like hour discussion,
Yeah.
and it's one of those like, this is why Darren also is like, let's just have a 30-minute talk and then we're done. I'm like, yeah, but you've got the ebb and flow, and like, let's be real here. Like, people listen because we're talking. That's what's happening. But anyways, thank you, Chris, for being on the podcast, and thank you guys out there for listening. Let us know what you think, and yeah. So again, until next time, MechWarriors, peace.
And here I thought I was off the record.
Nope, you're all on the record. You can't handle the truth.